commission for action. We've done that.
All right. Oh, lots of familiar faces here. This is, well, at least familiar names. The faces aren't showing up yet, but I hope you guys will show your faces there. Oh, this is great. So Eric, I think at least half of this group has read Nature by Design. So this is going to be an informed audience. I had several telling me how excited they were to have a chance to hear you talk on that. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think Travis, we'll just get started, and then if you
Sounds
want to
great.
admit people as they are in the room. Yeah, good evening, everybody. Happy Thursday. Really excited about tonight. We're going to be talking about ecological restoration, and we have Erig Higgs joining us this evening for a conversation with Dan Spencer, who I think a majority of you know. And I'll let them introduce themselves here in a sec, but just wanted to say how excited and thankful we are for Erig to be here. You know, feel free to ask questions, and just out of respect for our talkers, just keep yourself muted unless you are asking a question. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dan and Erig.
Let me just say, by way of just to start here again, and I will try to monitor the chat room. So if you want to put any questions in there, feel free to do so, but I'll probably have you ask them here. I'll have Erig introduce himself in just a moment, but I'll just give a little context on myself here. I started teaching at the University of Montana in 2002. And in 2004, I started teaching a summer course called Ethics, Fire, and Wilderness. And that was at that point that I came across Eric's writings on restoration. My partner, Patrick Burke, who teaches in the philosophy department, and I know some of the students here tonight, like Peyton Left Hand, are in his class. But Pat had started a company on ecological restoration called Bitterroot Restoration back in the mid 80s. And that was just about the same time that the Society for Ecological Restoration was getting started. And when I started doing talking about restoration as part of this broader context, Pat dug in his files and he pulled out this article in the 1990s called "What is Good Restoration" by Erig Higgs. And it was the first time I've read it. That was 18 years ago, I think now. I've been using it in my class still ever since. It's a classic in the field. And I've had the very good fortune of then having a chance to meet Erig on several occasions. Most recently, Erig has been doing some really interesting work on the possibility of forming a restoration ecology graduate education network that would get people from around the world together to practice restoration and think thoughtfully about it. But Erig is also, I think, Erig, you probably were the first philosopher to chair the board for the Society for Ecological Restoration. And I will let you introduce yourself now, but I can't tell you how thrilled I am that we have this opportunity to have this conversation with Erig tonight.
Thanks very much, Dan. What a pleasure it is to be in conversation with you. And thanks to Nick and Travis for setting this up too. So really glad to be here. I think I was the first philosopher to chair the SCR board and also the last philosopher to chair the SCR board, and likely it will never happen again. But that's another story. I want to acknowledge that I'm sitting here in Victoria, British Columbia, which is the colonial name for the territory, the unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, including several groups, and right around what was, their traditional territory. I'm sitting right atop gathering grounds for them, and it's been quite a journey the last few years to figure out what this means in terms of the work that I do, and so many of us do. So just wanted to acknowledge that.
Erig, let me just say thank you for that reminder as well, because we at the University of Montana are placed directly on traditional Salish lands, as well as the Kootenai and the Kalispell. But the University of Montana campus was traditional Bitterroot collecting grounds and camas collecting grounds
Right.
for the Salish and other groups there. And so yes, we're trying to be much more mindful about what that means in terms of our place and our history with this place and our future going forward.
Yeah, and the boundary conditions that set up the divide between our two countries, the nation states, the United States and Canada, went right through the traditional connections of peoples and the Strait Salish and the Coast Salish peoples. And of course, Camas was traded from southern Vancouver Island all the way over to Idaho. And so there's a lot of connection through this region that we're just rediscovering and trying to make sense of that. So anyway, thank you. And I'm a professor in the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria. And when I'm not thinking about restoration, I'm thinking a lot about mountains. I do a lot of my research work in mountains. And I don't know, I think I describe myself as kind of a lapsed philosopher. I did train in philosophy, and I don't do much of it anymore, anything that a philosopher, and I see, is that the Christopher Preston on the call? Right.
Perhaps he'll show himself. Hello, Christopher.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm here. I'm making dinner, so I didn't want to be running around. So I'm
now I'm hungry. Hi, Christopher. Yeah, so Christopher's a real philosopher, and I'm not. I took an empirical turn in my work a long time ago, and I've been fascinated also by ecology. And so I do a lot of work in landscape change with the idea of using historical knowledge in the service of restoration decisions. And so I do that in mountainous areas because I love mountains. Well, that's probably enough about me.
I think, yes, although I do think you're too modest, Eric, or at least I may have to change my teaching thing, because I always introduce you as the foremost philosopher of ecological restoration, who has set the term that is still largely being used to frame so much of the discussion today. So for someone who's lapsed, you still had a very profound impact on the field. And I guess that there's a series of questions here, and because we've got a mixed group tonight, it might be helpful to start with this one here. This is, how would you describe what it is you do to someone who's unfamiliar with ecological restoration? And what about the folks who are more familiar with ecological restoration? You've been very connected to the practice and the field in a variety of different ways over the years here, but what would be your short elevator pitch about, if somebody says ecological restoration, what is that?
Right, well, I use the SER definition still, and I think it's an important one. The process of assisting the recovery of ecosystems that have been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. That's the short version. I like it because it injects humility right into the definition. It's the process of assisting the recovery. So that's always meant a lot to me. And so restoration means many things, and it to many people, and is in the last number of years has spread across, maybe we'll talk more about this, but into a lot of allied fields, rewilding and forest landscape restoration and ecological design and revegetation and rehabilitation and reclamation and all sorts of other practices. And so it means a lot of things. So if you think of restoration as a big tent, that it describes a kind of movement, a social movement around those practices. Or you can take it to mean something quite austere, right? A very specific sort of practice. Mm-hmm. So my own work is in three areas. One is I'm very interested in the conceptual foundations of restoration. So why and how we do what we do in restoration. Secondly, how we mobilize that knowledge in the service of policy. So how we set principles, guidelines, standards for people doing restoration. And the third is in applied fieldwork, empirical work. So tracking change in mountains, trying to use that, figure out what those reference conditions from the past mean for us in a rapidly changing world.
So Eric, let me ask then how you actually got started in this. I do recall some of your doctoral work introduced you to some of the work like Albert Borgman, mm-hmm. which is talking about his philosophy of technology, and that's been influential in your work. But I'd also love if you would tell them a little bit about the Mountain Project that you've been working on for years in Jasper. and
Sure.
how that also influenced your activity.
Right. Well, just start, not to rehearse this or make it too tedious, but my origin story in restoration, I suppose, is that I took a first year university course at the University of Waterloo in Southern Ontario, where I had a field trip with Robert Dorney, who is a Canadian scientist who pioneered work in restoration. He was doing it really earlier than anyone else. His claim to fame is he has an article in the very first issue of Restoration and Management Notes, which to my knowledge is the first publication of restoration. And he had taken it at the front yard of his suburban tract home in Waterloo, Ontario, and converted it into this unruly, native garden. And I was astonished. It was like this radical gesture. I mean, it's not radical now, but it was radical back then in the late 1970s when I saw it. And it had profound influence on me. And when I went back to do my PhD, I came under his influence as he co-supervised my work. And more and more, I became interested in the idea of restoration, not only as an ecological process, but as a regenerative cultural one too. So that's sort of how I got into it. The work of the Mountain Legacy Project, which is for those of you, I'd be happy to, here, I'll just share it in the chat so you can get distracted by photographs as I talk. The Mountain Legacy Project is a project that grew out of work in Jasper National Park, so straight north along the Front Range of the Rockies. And we were trying to figure out in this protected area, so sort of a Yellowstone of Canada, whether restoration made sense. I thought it did. I went into that landscape and I saw it as a really peopled landscape. There are highways and fiber optic cables and campgrounds and all sorts of things. And then there was a deep history as well that we were learning about through archaeological work and connections with Indigenous peoples. So I saw this as it's a continuously kind of transformed landscape. And I wanted to understand it historically. We went out to try to gather historical information, and one of my graduate students came across this amazing collection of images. It was like photograph album upon photograph album, about this big, so 4 by 6 inches, 735 images from mountaintops all over, and they looked to be systematic. We had no idea what they were, but we thought it'd be fun to find one of the locations we could definitely, locate, and then see whether anything had changed. And we went there, and it was this sort of sense of vertigo when you got there, because it was hard to recognize. Even though we knew we were standing in the right spot, the landscape didn't make sense. It's changed so fundamentally. And so we use that kind of animated us to do work understanding changes in vegetation composition over a century. So it increased the time depth of our understanding. And then one thing led to another. We ended up spending 2 summers repeating all 735 photographs from 92 mountains. And it was, my back hurts still. And it was, and then we kept going. We realized that Canada had mapped its mountain west using a distinctive photographic technique used nowhere else in the world. So left behind, there's 120,000 high resolution, comprehensive, systematic black and white photographs from 1888 all the way through to 1958. So British Columbia, Alberta, and the Yukon and parts of the Northwest Territory are all covered by these images. So that's how we began working with them. And now it's sprawled from a little project on the corner of my desk. And it's sort of piled on over my desk and taken over my life. I'm doing a lot of work with that.
And that work has been ongoing for at least a couple of decades now.
Yeah, 20 years, 22 years now, yeah.
Well, Erik, your book, Nature by Design, came out almost 20 years ago, 2003. And a lot of the field of restoration has moved since that time. And so in that book, in fact, I'm going to put some of my students on the spot here. You are talking a lot about what should count as good restoration at that time there, and came up with 4 keystone concepts there. So let me just see if anybody out there can name those 4 keystone concepts. You should be able to recite them in your sleep. Seamus, remember any of those? Chris, any remember those?
Yeah, ecological integrity, of course. I'll do wild design and hand it off.
Yep.
How about Max?
Historical fidelity.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's my favorite one? It comes from Albert Borgman.
Focal
You're asking me?
All right, focal restoration. We've got that there. So anyway, that was you used that framework to really raise this question about what counts as good ecological restoration 20 years ago. And so part of this question is, what after 20 years, what do you see as the current state of restoration? Or are the threats the same as when you wrote Nature by Design? Are there new threats, different threats? How would you, if you were going to update that, how might you think about it today?
Well, that's a huge question. So I am updating it. So I'm at work slowly, as it seems to be these days, on a book called Changing Nature, which is a sort of a sequel to Nature by Design. Not quite, but it is. But a couple of observations. I don't know, so many things are pouring into my brain about this, but one is that I think I went back to look at those core principles again, and I think they're okay. I mean, I keep thinking they're outdated or they're outmoded or they need to be changed or they need to be modified, and they do. They certainly need to be reprocessed and updated. I think what I'm coming to is that we're missing a very critical category that defines restoration around social justice. So some commitment to social justice that doesn't really get captured adequately in any of the other categories. So that's what I've been working on right now. It's kind of a work in progress, but the notion that I still haven't come up with a better way of thinking about when we know an ecosystem is functioning quite well, other than to use the term integrity. I think it's a decent word, metaphorically speaking, and we can also parse it out in quantitative rigor. The idea of historical fidelity is a bit challenging right now. I think I would choose to use historical continuity instead. I think it's maybe a better term, especially in an era of rapid change. And I'm working a lot now with wild design and trying to figure out what we really mean by design, because it's coming into prominence a lot. So people are speaking more about how we actually design ecosystems through restoration. And so I think getting a handle on that. And then I'm still very attached to the idea of focal restoration, focal practices. And of course, that's very much from the Montana school, Albert Borgman's work, and the work that you teach, Dan, is just, it's being able to see restoration as a social practice, and one that enlivens the best of who we think we are and what we can contribute. That's what focal restoration is about. And it seems very meaningful to me in the restoration work that I observe and I work with locally here. I do a partnership with the Galliano Conservancy Association on Galliano Island, and we do a lot of restoration work there. And I see it playing out all the time. And when I work with my students, they seem to get it right away. So that's all helpful. But anyway, to your question about what's changed, I think the tensions that I was pulling out, and especially in chapter 5 of Nature by Design, where I was looking at kind of the technological constitution, my worry that, restoration could become commodified, it was slow to pick up. I kept seeing signs along the way that perhaps that was a worry. But a lot of my concerns from 2003 seem really quaint now. I mean, they seem really naive and quaint, given the scale of change and the locking in of kind of neoliberal economy and political reality. So I think that anytime like what, I'll back up and say that what restoration had going for it was that it was in the backwater 20 years ago. You know, a few of us cared about it, loved it, advocated on its behalf, but really it wasn't very prominent. You know, Pat Burke, for example, setting up bitter root restoration, he was way out ahead of most people in the work that he was doing. And, you know, he had a hard time convincing people, you know, to take it on and to fund it. But restoration's hit the big time. I mean, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration announced this year, and launched this year, and it has put tremendous pressure on restoration. And I think, you know, I'd love to talk more about whether that is, you know, what that's going to result in. I think we're going to see a lot of restoration that isn't terribly good, but we're going to see a lot of restoration.
Yeah.
Can I stop there? Sorry, I'm rambling.
Well, yeah, and I'm going to call on one of our colleagues here, Zach, in just a moment to pose a question as a follow-up on that. But I think I would rephrase. I don't know. I don't think you were naive, Eric. I think you were prescient. I think you really saw one of the real trends. And when we have our conversations in there, the ongoing tension between focal restoration and the tendency for it to get overwhelmed by technological restoration, and yet what gets lost when that happens continues to really animate a lot of our conversations, and we try to get some practice on that. But I wanted to ask Zach Schlanger to pitch in there. In one point in your book, you're talking about focal restoration. You contrast it with some of the other ones like ecocultural restoration here. And Zach has a question to ask you about that. Zach, you want to just unmute yourself and pose that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I guess this is also keeping along in the thought of the update, right, to Nature by Design. And I apologize if it's a little wooden. I'm going to read it the way I wrote it. So here we go.
No, that's fine. Fine.
All right. So when discussing ecocultural restoration in Nature by Design, you write that the idea of blending cultural integrity with desired ecological conditions has limited appeal. But for many indigenous peoples, restoration projects are as much about cultural survival as they are about ecological restoration. They're both restorative and rejuvenating. So this is clearly different than generating participatory restoration amongst non-Indigenous North Americans. So I'm wondering if in the intervening period, maybe like, should we give ecocultural restoration efforts our full support in parallel with the creation of focal restoration practices?
Sure, that's a great question. So here's what I was trying to do in criticizing the term ecocultural restoration. It wasn't the sentiment so much as the term, is I felt that that there was a risk of a certain kind of nativism arising in that term, because it seems that that it's pretty clear we can restore ecosystems, but what does it mean to restore cultural practices? It seems to me that there's risk in saying to people, well, things would be much better if you were to simply move back to the way that you engage the land or the waters back then. And most indigenous peoples see deep processes of cultural evolution, or the evolution of their ideas and practices in ways that reflect complicated environmental and cultural norms. And so I don't think we want to lock in the idea that there's just because it was done this way in the past, that this is how it ought to be done now. So that's why the term ecocultural restoration always irked me a little bit. The sentiment, though, the idea of there being a powerful opening for restoration to advance people's aspirations around deep engagement with place seems to me what we want. Does that make sense? Is that going in, am I answering or at least addressing what you're concerned about?
No, yeah, it makes sense to me. I guess in like part of what I'm getting at in that question is like, as far as sort of centering that, you know, the stewardship that that is like so tied to identity that can be a part of eco-cultural restoration. Like, should we really be promoting that as an alternative to like technological restoration?
Yes. I mean, I think this, I'm seeing this picked up a lot, importantly, in work that's being done right around. I'm just going to use some examples here. I mentioned the Galliano Conservancy Association, and we have a group of us have participated in a project in partnership with the Penelakut First Nation, which is another a nearby reserve where the Penelakut First Nation is located. And they're very interested in the propagation of native plants. And so they were lacking the facilities and the knowledge of plant propagation. So we partnered with them because we have expertise in that area and created something called the Nutsamat Forage Forest, which is a restoration project because it was a wet cedar forest that was logged, old growth that was logged and was starting to in its early successional process, but it was a mess. And so the idea was, you know, originally the idea was, can we restore this? Can we turn it back to a wet cedar forest? And then this partnership developed into a much richer program of trying to propagate plants that were used for foods, medicines, and materials traditionally by the Penelakut, and as a kind of anchor point for them to be able to have plant materials that they can use, but also to have sort of an example of what is possible under those conditions. So anyway, that a project like that, I think, manifests where you're trying to go with this. It's been criticized, though. People think it's not a restoration project because it's going to be managed. It will be managed. I mean, certain plants are not as desirable as others in a project like that. I mean, it's going to have high biodiversity and it's going to have the structural form of a cedar forest eventually. But there will be openings created in order to have opportunities for plants that are sun-loving and want drier conditions and so on to be managed that way. So more like a food forest, but it's like a restoration project. Where does it fit on that continuum?
Eric, maybe I can follow up on that because that we've had some really interesting conversations about this. And one of the things, if I'm reading Nature by Design correctly, which is an open question on that, but one of the things I thought you were doing in that section on preferring focal restoration to eco-cultural restoration was it made it much clearer what part of the culture you were trying to see as an antidote to. That is, the technological excess was the culture there. And so focal restoration was the antidote to that. And that, I think, works so well, whereas eco-cultural restoration is a broader, more generic term. It doesn't really give us much specificity in terms of what dimensions of culture on that. But one of the things that has been emerging, and I know it's been emerging a lot for your work in Canada as well, but there's some really interesting and challenging questions about how and in what ways restoration relates to the project of settler colonialism, white supremacy, different things. Is it one more practice in traditional conservation ones that simply perpetuates that paradigm with good intentions, but perpetuates that paradigm and continues to erase indigenous peoples, essentially that earlier perception that we were kind of restoring to a pre-disturbance state, which we just don't, that's not the way we think about landscapes now in North America, which have been inhabited for tens of thousands of years. And so you mentioned that, what part of what was missing, you thought that could be added today would be more attention to social justice. But I wonder if there could be even more specificity in terms of really much more careful attention to indigenous histories of the land, and how does restoration act constructively with those histories as opposed to inadvertently perpetuating the colonial histories?
Well, that needs to be written, I think, Dan. I mean, and it needs to be written really widely, because I think there's a great deal of superficial attention being paid to Indigenous connections to the land. And I don't see it being expressed widely or coherently in the literature right now. So it's not there for people to learn much about it. And so a lot more work needs to be done in that area, unless I'm misreading it or I haven't seen the literature on it, but I'm not seeing it much on it right now. And it's something that I feel obliged to do some work on, but I haven't really dug into that yet. I did an article in 2005 called "The Two Culture Problem," which you know, sort of begins to nibble the edges of this, but not expressed in a sufficiently profound way around the depredations of colonialism.
Yeah,
And restoration's role in kind of addressing that and squarely saying, what do we do?
Well, when I try and do literature searches on it, I mean, Dennis Martinez was writing about it early on, and there seemed to be an Indigenous network, but I haven't seen much for many years that seems to have followed up on that. And so again, I do think it's an area that and I think more and more we need to, or there needs to be partnership among multiple folks. For example, the Flathead Reservation, and I see one of our students, Peyton Left Hand, is a member of the Kootenai Nation and the Flathead Reservation, and they're doing some really, really innovative work in restoration that integrates cultural restoration, the recovery of the bull trout in particular, as part of that area there. But again, like I think you say, it isn't making it into the more mainstream conversations as much as it needs to, because I think it's a critical point on that. Let me ask Seamus there. Seamus has posted a question in the chat room that he'd like to ask you about.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I wanted to kind of pick up on this stuff specifically to ask maybe a different question about how we're telling the story of restoration. I think you mentioned that the kind of big tent idea, and I think there's a lot of change between when you wrote Nature by Design and now in terms of what is considered restoration, what people want to welcome folks into the definition with, and so I mean Dan did such a great job of laying out the story of the debate about restoration, and we really, I mean, that was what we did in our essays, and it was such a fantastic exercise. But I think I'm wondering, as we have these debates on the cutting edge of what's needed and the political valences of these efforts, how might we better tell the story of restoration so that we're not talking about when was the first time restoration showed up in the literature, as the only story of what restoration is?
Yeah. I remember Bill Jordan, bless him, who wrote extensively especially in the earlier stages of restoration in the United States, but always described the work of the University of Wisconsin Arboretum as like the Kitty Hawk of restoration. And I remember him being taken on by a cultural theorist doctoral student at a conference, who just said, what kind of story are you telling about restoration when you say that? When you mention that, like, why does that matter? Isn't that playing into a particular narrative that we want not to, reference in this? So it always made me think about, what stories do we tell and what ought we tell? I mean, we know that narrative is powerful, that testimonial knowledge is really what moves people. And so I think we have not told in sufficiently lyrical tones what happens in restoration, and we need to do more of that. So if you look at, for example, where are there compact cases that are well curated about restoration? Where are they? The only source I know of recently was the 2012 IUCN document, in which they're painstakingly developed these really lovely short cases that describe all, restoration and a fair bit of diversity through these dozen cases. But SER has never been able to quite nail this because they haven't curated their cases. They've allowed sort of self-reporting through the Global Restoration Network and that sort of thing. So we don't, there's some good, I go back to, the book by Freeman House. Do you know that?
Oh, yeah.
Totem Salmon, which I think is for me, that's one of the most powerful accounts of what restoration can be. I'm still go back and dip into that all the time. Stephanie Mills wrote a book in the 90s called In Service of the Wild, which was lovely in its way. And we see, American writers like Robert Michael Pyle pulling up some of this, and there's other folks who are telling different kinds of stories about what restoration means. I don't think I'm being very analytic here. I'm just describing what I think, where those stories need to be seeded from. What do you think?
Thank
Seamus?
you. No, I really appreciate that. Bill Jordan's book was kind of what spurred me to come back to think about this at a higher level. I was doing coastal dune restoration, and I'm actually currently in a creative writing class trying to sort through some of that while thinking about these things. So I appreciate that emphasis on storytelling. I think it does so much for the political and for making these, like you mentioned, mobilizing these concepts. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I wrote about the alternate ways that we could think about restoration, or which think about landscapes in the future, when I was sitting in Jasper National Park doing work years ago, as saying that there were different realities that were being processed. There was this sort of incarcerated reality of a national park. We set boundaries around it and we patrol the boundaries to keep, damage out. And then there was the kind of cornucopian narrative that was popular, where national parks can serve many, many needs, right? We can have heli-tourism and God knows what in parks. But I was arguing, I said, there's a different story we can tell too about a kind of a regenerative or restorative paradigm, where, we don't need necessarily to think that in 100 years, we're going to have less ecological integrity. Maybe we'll have more. And maybe we'll have deeper connections with the cultural past than we have presently. And so I think being able to open up people's possibility space around what can happen is really important. And restoration ought to be a powerful agent in that.
Seamus, while you've got the floor there, I'm going to put you on the spot again for just a moment. Erig, Seamus was in the ethics and restoration class this fall, and was a consistent voice of concern that so oftentimes when restoration planning is being done, there's very little attention to the carbon footprint in that. And Seamus, do you want to just talk a little bit more about how you brought that up and how that's a concern for restoration work for you?
Yeah, so I mean, it's so easy to ask the question, so I want to contextualize my prodding here. I just think I was constantly seeing restoration plans, push to become the best they could be within the budget that they had, and have to some extent a public face, which is, as we're talking about, very important for the movement, but being unwilling to acknowledge the carbon footprint of their behavior and of their action. And I wrote in an essay to Dan, just kind of proposing the idea of using carbon as bringing it more fully into the frame, and acknowledging where there's a carbon sequestration happening. So there's not just the dozers releasing carbon, but it was just a point of, I found for myself working in restoration and for other practitioners, a point of insecurity of where we were within this urgency, and carbon as a driving force of climate change. And I was just very concerned that it wasn't centrally focused in these conversations. And when you're seeing beautiful things happen only because of heavy equipment. You just wondered what to say about that.
Right. Of course, you're aware that there's a remarkably well-greased slope here, because if carbon becomes the currency of restoration, then you optimize carbon sequestration, and you do that primarily through the ecosystems that people seem to like, at least superficially, and those are forests. So all the other types of wetlands, including the coastal dune projects you were working on, become subsidiary to forests, and you see that globally right now because of this central focus on forest landscape restoration and forest restoration. And then within that, you open up the possibility of having, faster growing genetically type species that will accelerate the sequestering of carbon. And so anyway, I think it's difficult, but let me give you a funny example, which I really like. Two examples. I really love this, that I was attracted to the work of the Galliano Conservancy Association, which was led by Ken Millard, the late Ken Millard. He was a quantum physicist who bailed out of that and became a traditional instrument maker, made the viola da gamba was his specialty. And he made these viola da gambas, sort of ancient music, played in an ancient music ensemble, and then gave that up because of health reasons and formed this insurgent environmental organization on a small island in the Salish Sea. In his early work, they decided that they couldn't afford to buy land that was highly valued because, like so-called, high ecological integrity land, because it's too expensive. So they bought the cutover lands, the really damaged. In one case, this land was so cheap because no one could ever imagine anything being done on it. It was a mess. They decided to do a restoration project on it. And because there was no rule book around for how you do something like that, they just made it up as they went. And they made a commitment at the very beginning that they weren't going to use any fossil fueled powered equipment. So Ken was a physicist, right? PhD in physics. So things as simple as pulleys were not a problem for him. So he developed this really fantastic, sort of, I don't know what loggers call it, but the skywork, the cable system to be able to yard logs around and do creative things. And he figured out that, if you could pull these young saplings over with their root ball intact, it would create this microhabitat that this bulldozed forest patch really needed. And so they would climb the trees and attach big cables, and they would pull them over using just come-alongs and mechanical power. It was crazy, right? And it was a ton of volunteer activity to do it, but never did they use a chainsaw. There was no heavy equipment involved. So it's very cool. I mean, in a kind of a radical way, not something that you can necessarily replicate everywhere. But his successor, in a sense, his spiritual successor, is a young guy by the name of Adam Huggins, who eschews power equipment whenever he can. And so he uses, for example, these really fancy, tiny little weed scythes. I don't know if you've seen them, but little cutting scythes, not the big Austrian ones, the big long ones, because they damage too easily in rough ground. They're short and they're quite wide. And that's what he uses those over a weed whacker any day. So it does suggest that we can make choices that may or may not save the planet exactly, but what they do is they instruct us around what's important. They become very important symbolic gestures around what the actions are that are needed. But I don't know. There's two kind of funny examples for you.
Thanks, Eric. I know Nick has got his hand up here.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So I don't know if this is a question or a comment, and if it is a question, I don't know if there is an answer to it. But so like Seamus, I've had the opportunity to do practice restoration. I did some glade restoration in the Ozarks in Missouri, which is a very specific and kind of special ecosystem to that region. And part of that restoration plan called for the removal of invasive species, both flora and fauna. And so as a pretty staunch vegetarian for morality reasons, one of the projects was building feral hog traps, right, to catch feral hogs, which are a problem there. And I built the traps very well, knowing what was ultimately going to be the result of those traps, that the hogs weren't going to, an amusement park to have fun. And so I guess how for someone like myself who wrestles with the killing of an invasive animal, seeing that as problematic, even though I know that it's in doing so, it's going to restore or help the native flora or the native fauna. Because we did read a case study in Dan's class, I took it 2 falls ago, about in the Stephen Mather Wilderness, getting rid of invasive fish in the alpine lakes, and very similar
Right.
type of thing. It was poisoning everything in the lake to introduce native trout species again. And so I'm obviously very aware that the results of that is good, but that also means that there is going to be a slaughter, unfortunately, of other animal species that were placed there, that are there, not, it's not their fault, right? Like the actions of us have placed these animals in these positions. So I guess, yeah, how would one wrestle with knowing that, like, it's the right decision, but also feeling guilty about it, or thinking, about the kind of the dark or negative aspect of that?
Right. Well, it's a potent question, and one that ought to be at the forefront of a lot of restoration work. I'm not sure it is. I mean, I think with the dynamic I've seen play out so often is that there are sort of the true believers in restoration who have a very fixed idea that there's a species that is demonstrably bad that needs to be gone, and the means to achieve it are subsidiary to the goal of eliminating the species, and not the species, but the population. And this gets us into trouble over and over again. And I think all you need to do is read literature on deer culling and hyperabundant deer to know what a mess that is. And we're seeing it playing out right now, real time, in the city of Victoria, where we have hyperabundant deer population. And half the community seems to be really keen on culling the deer, and the other half is like, no way. So you have these sharp ethical divides over what ought to be done, and no easy way forward, right? Because there isn't, it is pretty sharply divided. So I think there's lots of approaches that can be taken. I'm not sure I have any kind of more sophisticated theoretical answer on this, as I'm wary of dabbling in ethics here. But I think one way is to acknowledge what we're doing as an act of harm, and to not forget that if you remove English ivy from a forest floor, or as you say, trap hogs, that this is, why are we doing it? What are we achieving through that process, right? That act of harm, and to acknowledge it as harm. But there's trade-offs as well. I think so that's one way. I think just being explicit about what we're doing, and I don't think we always are. So I think restoration ecologists are often pretty blinded to those wider issues, my experience anyway. But another way we can do it is my colleague Peter Arcese at the University of British Columbia has done a lot of work with black-tailed deer, and he's worked on the archipelago, the San Juan and the Gulf Islands, between here and Vancouver. What he's done is he said, all right, if we harm black-tailed deer by reducing their population, we are giving benefit to songbird diversity, because there's a strict correlation that he's shown between songbird diversity and reduction in deer. So, you get, they're inversely related. So you get, and it's a really, really powerful relationship. So deer can't exist at more than 0.1 animal per hectare and have any hope of songbird diversity in these islands. So in a sense, then it becomes sort of a moral, at least something that we can weigh, right? We can say, this is a difficult choice. It sucks. But now we know what the complications are ecologically. So in saying that you want lots of deer means that you don't want lots of songbirds. So there's some choice there. So that's another way forward. We can go on. Does that make, how do you
Yeah,
think
no,
we ought to address it?
I appreciate that. No, and I think I wrote about this in a paper for Dan. I think this was my final paper. And I think what I came to the conclusion is that I'm at peace with it as long as it is understood, like what is happening here, that restorationists, aren't turning a blind eye to the actions that are occurring. And I think my problem with the feral hog specifically was that it seemed to me that it was a game for a lot of people. Like they were not being respectful that these were, like these were living animals, regardless of how much damage that they do and how dangerous they are. That it was fun, right? And so I think as long as people are respectful towards this, to the wildlife that they are ultimately having to kill, I think allows me to sleep better at night.
Yeah, there's a really interesting project. I should, I'll dig it up. I won't right now, but I can send it on to Dan or to you. And it's called a Feed the People. And again, it's being done in partnership with the Penelakut First Nation, where there's an interest in reducing the population of hyperabundant black-tailed deer on the Gulf Islands, so Galiano Island specifically, where I've been describing. But there's also an interest in food security, a big interest in food security, because it is an island. Everything has to come from, either be produced locally or come from away. And so the idea is that there's a potential for sort of a protein source that hasn't been previously available. So the partnership with the Penelakut is where it gets really interesting, because Penelakut want additional hunting capacity because their island is quite small too, and they don't have enough deer because they're putting a lot of hunting pressure on the deer. So they're now partnering and running workshops, and the workshops have been selling out. There's been 3 of them now, 20 people each. And Penelakut elders come over, they hunt, and then they help people understand how to butcher a deer and how to package it and cook it and do all sorts of things with wild meat. It's done with enormous ceremony and with, respect. All of what we read about, respectful hunting practices are being employed. And people are really wanting this kind of knowledge and using it in a way that seems to me to be richer than we would have ordinarily. So that's another way.
Eric, I'm going to follow up on and put Chris Pringy on the spot here in just a moment. But one of the things I've appreciated so much when we read your work in our book is that you bring a Canadian perspective, because we tend to be very US centric here. But we do focus on one subset issues, and that is the debate. I know you know Peter Landris and some of his work, and about whether or not we should be doing restoration in wilderness. And by that, I mean US designated wilderness under the Wilderness Act, and here it just has constraints in them in terms of untrammeled and natural and so forth. And so we look at some different case studies, and Nick was referring to one of the ones we look at is when there are several cases where we have a lot of high alpine lakes that historically were fishless, and then were stocked with fish, and then that really had all sorts of ecological trophic cascading effects in there. But Chris has been actually working in weed control in areas that is actually a wilderness study area rather than designated wilderness right now, but kind of thing there. And Chris, I wonder if you just ask a little bit about the work that you're doing and the pervasiveness of weeds in wilderness and wilderness study areas, and how we think about that in terms of restoration versus introducing toxic chemicals into wilderness, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, Dan. I was just thinking about this myself, that I guess I'm wrestling right now. A question that comes to my mind is it time, with how our planet is changing, to start addressing this human construct of wilderness and really wrestling with policy behind wilderness? Because reading something, looking at Yosemite National Park's plan with treating their weeds in wilderness areas in that national park, their goal obviously is early detection, rapid response detect it early, because if you don't and it gets to spread, then wilderness character is compromised. My question though is, it's hard to detect early. They don't have personnel, they don't have, there's constraints, right? So
Sure.
as wilderness areas continue to get encroached upon, I think it's only a matter of time. We spray weeds in the backcountry that would probably surprise people how much is actually back there in a proposed wilderness area. Is it time for us to start, and is it our responsibility to start saying, you know what, wilderness is changing. Like this was our construct to start with anyway. Is it time to redefine trammeling? What is trammeling and how does that fit with restoration? Because we are using, chemicals and herbicides in the backcountry, although it's not broadcast spraying. There are areas that you think about, wow, and I know my colleague Zach will laugh at this, but wow, should we actually aerial spray that hillside? Because or biocontrols, and biocontrols opens up a whole nother can of worms with some people. But I guess I want to get your take on, is it time that we address wilderness as a concept in order to properly restore some of these areas into the future?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think time is well past for that. But I speak as a Canadian. We don't have the same cultural register for wilderness that you do in the US. It's so deeply embedded. I mean, we certainly do to an extent as this sort of Euro-colonial idea, but I mean, the problem with wilderness, the trouble with wilderness was what Cronin in many ways identified in the mid-90s with his book. And we need to be telling different stories about these places if we're going to be able to responsibly intervene in them. And there was a project that I was involved with, Laura Young and David Cole at the University of Montana, got a group together to talk about, and eventually resulted in a book called Beyond Naturalness, which was during the last part of the Bush era, was an attempt to try to get parks managers in particular to think differently about the idea of wilderness. So we need to be telling a different story. We need to see these landscapes as, really thickly culturally infused, right? Through long indigenous practices. We need to see them as places that are undergoing change, and that some of that change we're not going to be able to do too much about. Some of it we can. So yeah, I would definitely need to tell different stories. I think the wilderness story has actually really harmed the ecological integrity in the US and other places, Canada too. So it's said that there are these places that are very special and we need to protect them and put them away, but everything else we can mess with. And that's not a good message. And that's not really what the story of ecological restoration that ought to be told. Because restoration, as you know, I mean, there's pocket restoration projects all over the place in people's front yards and, civic parks, on university campuses and public school yards and all over the place. I mean, they're not large, but they're significant in some ways, right? About biodiversity, conservation and restoration. Excuse me. So I don't know. That's how I would respond.
Eric, you do talk about that actually quite eloquently in your first chapter on the two wildernesses in Nature by Design. And actually,
sure,
Max has a follow-up question about that, because we use that framework for quite a bit of our discussion in the class there. So Max, do you want to pose your question?
Sure, yeah, definitely. Sticking with the theme of wilderness, because there's a lot to get into there. And we talk about it a lot with restoration in wilderness. And I really enjoyed A Tale of Two Wildernesses. And I was fascinated, but also kind of terrified at the same time with your description of Disney's Wilderness Lodge. And I was just curious to hear your kind of story on your paper with Jennifer, I believe it's Jennifer Cipher on Disney's Wilderness Lodge and how it came to be, how your first became aware of what was going on down there, and just hear your perspective and your story.
That's really funny. I was teaching at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, but previously I'd been at Oberlin College teaching there. And I had a student from Oberlin who I was in regular touch with, Jonathan Perry, who used to send me outrageous things. This is back in the day at the dawn of email. So this was, things would arrive in the post. And Jennifer Seifer was a new master's student working with me. And that particular day I was to meet with her, and went by the mailbox in the office and picked up this package from Jonathan. And in it was promotional material for Disney's new Wilderness Lodge. And I looked at it, I thought, this is the most ridiculous thing ever, because immediately all my, whatever antenna went up, and I became sort of knee jerk and said, this is crazy. But then I went into the meeting with Jennifer, and I had this stack of mail on the table, and she was kind of in despair at that moment. She was trying to figure out what to do, and she was asking questions about, she really wanted to understand from a cultural perspective how we make sense of nature in contemporary society. She said, I just don't know what to study. So I pulled out this piece of mail and I said, here, study this. And so as is only possible with someone who is fearless like Jennifer was, she actually contacted the Disney Corporation, and she got through somehow. And she's very persistent, and she ended up getting permission, the first person who received permission to go behind the scenes and to interview some of the staff who were involved with the design process, including architects. And then she wanted to go and actually stay there. She had hoped to actually, be resident at the Wilderness Lodge for a little while, but she couldn't afford it. So she did all her interviews, staying at a youth hostel in Orlando and taking the bus in with the support workers at the Wilderness Lodge. So it was pretty fun. And she did all these amazingly candid interviews that she was able to publish. That's how the project took off. And the more we dug into it, the more it became this, it was a wild project. It's a wild project. And neither one of us have ever stayed at the Wilderness Lodge because we couldn't afford it. And it was booked up years in advance at the time we were doing this work.
You tell that wonderful story about being the first person to ask for a coffee cup that's an actual porcelain cup rather than a disposable one in the nearby model city there. It's just
gosh, that's right. Oh yeah, there was also Celebration City. The world seemed like it had just become loosened for me. I couldn't make sense of a lot of things, but yeah, it was pretty wild.
Eric, I would just say, one of the things that is so lovely about Nature by Design, and I'm hoping this will be part of Changing Nature as well, but you do have so many really wonderful stories and anecdotes that illustrate so many different things, and they leave really strong images to help connect the conceptual framework you're working with attached to these stories. And I think that's a real strength of the book, that we've been able to use a lot. They become kind of catchphrases when we talk about them, and as we move through the discussion on that. So it's really good.
Yeah, curious of, there's a comment from Nick, curious if glamping has become the new Wilderness Lodge. Yeah, we didn't hear about glamping 6 or 7 years ago, and it's everywhere now. So probably true. Can I put in a plug for an amazing podcast series? Some of you may know it, called Future Ecologies.
That would be great.
So it is a bit of, have I spelled that right? I can't even read it. I'm not sure I have.
Maybe an extra U in there, but I think we got it.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so Adam Huggins and his partner Mendel have been running this podcast series. It's now in its 3rd year, and it's taken off internationally, and they do some really great things. I feel quite honored that they put me together with Oliver Kellhammer, who's a designer from the New School in New York, and he summers on Cortez Island every year, so out on the West Coast here, and he's been doing some really fascinating work, design. So the series is a 3-part series earlier this year called Nature, by Design, and it's kind of this really creative play. And he actually goes back in the second of those 3 podcasts to look at the Wilderness Lodge, because it turns out that Adam Huggins, who's like mid-30s or so, his father was an Imagineer with the Disney Corporation. And so Adam actually got to go stay at the Wilderness Lodge. So it's quite resonant for him.
Huh. I know Nathaniel Miller has had his hand up for a while. Nathaniel, do you want to pose a comment or question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
So I'm majoring in ecological science and restoration here at UM, and it's pretty cool because I have Kara Nelson as my faculty advisor. I don't know how well you know her, but and so anyways, I was just going to ask. So a few months ago, there was some research that some UK researchers did in Kazakhstan in the steppe there, over a huge area, like 3 times the size of the state of Montana, where when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was sort of like Chernobyl, where everyone basically left pretty much overnight because, I mean, the subsidies ended and it just all collapsed. So there's no anyone there. Kind of looking at how the ecosystem will respond to basically being entirely on its own, with no one at all on it. And they kind of found this surprisingly mixed bag where some animal and plant species like rebounded, but others actually have suffered heavily without people living there. And so it kind of reminded me of, I think you talked about maybe how we need to rethink conservation in the sense that, you know, conservation, at least in a lot of Western countries, has tended to be, we put, you know, we make an area a park and then we kind of kick the people out. You know, it's like a look but don't touch attitude where people can hike and camp, but, you know, the idea of people living in a protected area and ranching and farming or doing whatever else is kind of anathema to some. And so how would you bridge that gap in collaborative efforts with those who hold that strong attitude where they believe that there shouldn't be any sort of humans living in any sort of quote unquote natural area? You know, there's some that, you know, who have strong beliefs that way, or, you know, their idea is there should be no one here. Like they're like kind of, I don't know how to describe it, almost purist, where, you know, their idea of conservation is, you know, there's like no people at all, you just pass through. And so how do you bridge perhaps people who might have strong disagreements with an idea of allowing people to live in a protected area who have those strong attitudes?
Right. I'm not sure. It's a good question. I think that increasingly we're finding that the myth of the pristine is just a myth. It's just not accurate. So in areas where we think there's been no one, there usually is an erased history. So there is, you know, there's an erasure that needs to be understood and recovered. So I think that's part of it. So I think there's a kind of naivete around that. People think, oh, it's pristine. I mean, there are some admittedly unusual places. I think I write about this, but the Snaring Valley in Jasper National Park, you know, woe betide anyone who tries to get up the Snaring Valley. It's brutal. And it's just like it's naturally protected. And so it's very difficult to imagine that there was extensive peopling at any point or the extensive travel. So you get these little areas, but I think Gary Paul Nabhan was right in saying that, you know, this is, the world was, you know, the world had a lot of distribution of human activity and cultural practices, you know, for a really long time. And so whenever we come across these big areas where we don't apparently see that, it's usually inaccurate. I've been really a big fan of the work that's being done by Rewilding Europe. Or do you know that organization? Have you come across that, Nathaniel?
No, but I took a forestry ethics class where we kind of covered that, so I'm familiar with the concept.
Right. So what's interesting is there's sort of like a North American view of rewilding, and then there's this distinctive European view that's become very popular in the last few years. And in fact, the first ever chair of rewilding, professorship in rewilding in the world, it was created last December, just a few months ago. It's being held by an amazing scientist, Lisbeth Bakker. She's remarkable. And she's working with this originally Dutch it's Dutch-based organization that's going across Europe, doing rewilding. It's trophic rewilding primarily. So they acknowledge this is not about creating these areas that are walled off from people, but working to create wildness within spaces that have been peopled. And it's really quite brilliant. I think it's amazing work. But it doesn't make traditional restoration ecologists very happy. Makes them feel awkward. So, I think Europeans and North Americans have often differed in how they see restoration. But certainly check out Rewilding Europe, and if you want some inspiration. And just to give you a sense, they had an inaugural workshop to mark Lisbeth Bacher's assumption of this new professorship, and 1,200 people showed up for the workshop. It was a virtual workshop, but 1,200 people attended. To give you a sense of scale.
Eric, we've got about 15, 20 minutes left, and I'm wondering, we've been peppering you with questions, but here you've got this group of students studying in Montana from all over. Do you have any questions that you want to ask of folks here, or any topics that you want to open up for further conversation?
There are a couple topics that I'd be interested in exploring or just mentioning anyway. I'm always I'm very glad to hear about the experiences that people are having in contemplating restoration. So if you have, I suppose I'd invite you, if you've got, especially people who haven't had a chance to speak yet, if you've got stories of your own with respect to restoration or quandaries that you're facing, please don't hesitate. I'd be glad to engage that. I'll mention two things quickly, and then we can see if we want to pursue them. The first is around ecological novelty. Yeah. So for a while, I was characterized as the Darth Vader of ecology for helping to introduce this concept of novel ecosystems, which is a very precise formulation of the idea of ecological novelty. But the notion that we are creating these non-analog ecosystems, and that we now don't quite know what to do with. They're kind of partially inert to restoration, so it's creates quandaries about how restoration can deal with them. But more significantly, and I think one of the challenges that a lot of people are wrestling with in restoration now is what has been termed hybrid ecosystems. So these are intermixes of historically continuous species and populations, and ones that have never been there before. And so these hybrid ecosystems are really tricky because they just mess us up. And so we have a lot of hybrid ecosystems where I live right now. We have forests in which the dominant species on the forest floor is English ivy. Okay. So anyway, it seems that the concept of ecological novelty is here to stay in lots of ways. I'd be interested in knowing if people have had encounters with it and what you think of it. It's certainly taken off. I think Tina Hager and her colleagues in Germany have produced the most interesting comprehensive paper on the topic in 2019. I can dig it up and send it along. So that's one. Anyway, that's one topic. And the other topic is just around principles and standards in ecological restoration, which is a subject I have strong views about. So.
Well, that actually was Max early on was going to ask a question about that, because you addressed that in Nature by Design at a preliminary stage. And now that the SER has come out with these standards there, I know that I think I reviewed a paper you co-authored about that. So Max, do you want to pose your question? But I'd love to hear Eric address that a little bit too.
Yeah, I'll pose my very short question, and we can see if we want to go with it or not. In Dan's course, we initially talked about at the end, we don't have time to cover everything, but how SER had just come out with standards for ecological restoration, and if you're going to take on a larger ecological restoration project, you need to get a certification now. We didn't really have too much of a chance to talk about that, but I was like, is that a good thing? I don't know. Does that get in the way of focal restoration? Because I was super interested. Anyway, that was my question. Is that a good thing?
Well, I always thought we should sort of follow the a different path and certify ecosystems as opposed to the people who do it. But that's another longer conversation. Well, I value creativity in restoration. And I've always thought that what fascinates me about restoration is the way in which people learn through, in a sense, it sounds like a diminishment of it, but tinkering with the ecosystem, trying things like that story I told about, yarding trees over so their root ball, creates microtopography. And that's an example. Nobody had done that. There was no cookbook that said, here, do this. It was just, they thought, I wonder, that would make sense. So they did it. And we see a lot of that in restoration.
Pizza or salad?
I'm sorry? Sorry, I missed that, or I
No,
got some feedback. Oh, okay, sorry.
I had my
Yeah,
mic.
so, right, so that exuberance that we see in restoration through that sort of community-based practice and, focal restoration, that sort of thing, I think that generates a lot of creativity, and we need to nurture that and continue that. And so when Canada, the Canadian Parks Council and the National Parks Agency in Canada produced the first ever principles and guidelines for ecological restoration at a national level in the world, that was in 2008. They decided to create 3 very broad principles that made sense to a kind of expert group who had advised on the process. And they said that we want restoration that's effective, efficient, and engaging. And we'll dig into what those mean. But the idea is you've got these 3 principles that are very open and adaptable for a wide variety of circumstances. And then you back those up with guidelines, which give a next level of specificity. So what does it mean when you talk about, effectiveness in restoration? What does that actually mean? What are the guidelines around it? And that gives, sort of a bit more scaffolding around the idea. And then you provide a lot of, in a sense, practices, examples that give people a sense of what to do. And then you turn people loose and you say, here's generally how you would do a restoration project. Here's some principles, here's the guidelines, work within that. And that's where I think you get innovation, you get a culture of innovation. And that was picked up in 2012 by Karen Keenlyside and her team when they wrote the Royal Commission on Protected Areas document for parks. So it was their first ever international advice on restoration. And they actually picked up the Canadian principles. It was effective, efficient, and engaging. And so they found that it had universal appeal in a sense. They had representatives from 17 countries contributing to that document. And so for the first time, we had this sort of, I really like that document a lot. And I think it provides a really nice, open, flexible model that works just about everywhere. It gives a lot of space for people to operate because we know there's a lot of cultural variety in the world, of course. We talk a lot about, I've spoken about North American and European views of restoration, but that, you can extend that all the way around the globe, and there's all sorts of different takes on what restoration means. But there's also tremendous diversity of ecosystems. So, a coastal salt marsh doesn't get, restored the same way as, subalpine meadow. So you give flexibility. But so when SCR came along in 2016, 2015, and they started working on a document, this is my view. I'm sure Karen Nelson has quite different views on it. So, and Karen, I don't probably fully see eye to eye, although I have a lot of respect for Kara's work. They kind of panicked and they said, oh my gosh, we have this 2004 document called the Primer. Some of you may have come across the SCR Primer. It was kind of the dominant view of restoration, but it was getting very outdated. And there have been a couple of peer-reviewed articles that said, hey, you've got to really do something about this primer, because it's really outdated. It doesn't talk about climate change, doesn't talk much about cultural practices, we need to do something. So SCR kind of panicked and they put together a document based on standards that have been developed in Australia. And that document was itself contentious in Australia. And there were restoration ecologists who just did not think it was the right way to go. And so it was kind of, it wasn't exactly a, you know, global change like Australia for world, but it was kind of like that. And the document came together very quickly. And that 2016 document was problematic in a lot of ways. And it, I felt compelled, as did my colleagues. I wrote an article in which we had 5 former chairs of this of SER and the president and the past editor of the journal Restoration Ecology writing, saying there's a difference between a principles-based approach to restoration and a standards-based approach to restoration. Standards work when you have controlled, repeatable, well-organized systems. So think plumbing or electricity works, you know? You probably want standards when you're wiring your house, but ecosystems that aren't that simple, and they're probably not going to be that simple. And so we need something that's a more open and flexible and adaptable structure. So that's how that came about. So I feel that, and then SER revised in 2019 with their international standards, it's better, but I find aspects of it quite incoherent. So that's my view. We can go on about that for a long time, but I still think I would be much happier if they just backed away from this idea that we're trying to create standards and just said, hey, here's some principles. Let's flesh those out. Let's allow people to see where they go. So that's one problem. And the other problem with the standards is that they have created, I think, quite an austere idea of what restoration is. So they've created this recovery wheel and this restoration continuum. And you really feel like crap if you're working on a project that doesn't have any potential for being a 5-star restoration project. And like, what do you do with that? Or you've got an ecosystem that's hybrid or novel, and you know, what are you going to do with that? So it's created this idea that restoration is pretty highly specified. It's a tiny tent, relatively speaking. It's partly that I think has led to this efflorescence of practices around the world, like rewilding, like forest landscape restoration, that are sort of, in a sense, going around ecological restoration right now. So apparently I can get on a little bit of a soapbox on this, so I'll stop there. What does that resonate? What do you think about that? Am I off kilter on this?
Well, I can kind of chime in because I've taken all of Kara's classes. So I'm actually in a class where we covered the recovery wheel as one of the first things we read was that pulling out of that document. So I could definitely see your point. And so, you know, it's interesting. I mean, how do you balance then being innovative while also ensuring they have principles that sort of make sure they sort of guide people. So it's not just totally unorganized, especially since everyone wants to, you know, ramp this stuff up big time. I mean, the UN with, the pushing, as you talked about, they're pushing for the next 10 years to do, you know, massive ecological restoration. So then how do we balance sort of innovation with also making sure that principles sort of help guide people to sort of keep moving along, I guess, best way I could put it.
Yeah. If you look at the 2019 international standards, there's another challenge in them, in which that initial recovery wheel was developed in Australia and went unchanged into the 2016 version of the standards, and then got pulled forward in 2019. But if you look at the recovery wheel, it's got, of course, just biophysical characteristics that are being assessed. So that runs contrary to, I think, how restoration ought to work generally. There's a lack of focality in that, but they've introduced something called a social recovery wheel. And so it's a separate wheel. And a lot of people are picking up that and saying, oh, well, that's the recovery wheel for restoration, but it's not actually, because there's this other recovery wheel within the standards. So I think needs to be some reconciliation between those two ideas. They're sort of separating out social and ecological practices.
Eric, I got one. I know we're nearing the end of our time, and I've got lots of questions I'd like to too also, but Peyton Left Hand is here, and as I mentioned, Peyton is a member of the Kootenai Nation on the Flathead Reservation, and I asked him if he would just speak a little bit about his grandfather's legacy and protection of sacred lands and the connection to Indigenous restoration. So Peyton, do you want to tell us a little bit about your grandfather? And
yeah, so my grandfather's name was Patrick Left Hand. He was a member of the Kootenai tribe as well. For those of you that don't know, the Kootenai tribe, like, it's 6 bands of Kootenai people. 2 of them, one's in Idaho, one's in Montana, and then the other 4 go up into Canada, like Windermere area. And anyway, so my grandfather, he was working with the Native American. Hold on.
you just muted yourself, like Peyton. Unmute yourself.
Oh yeah, sorry. The Native American Rights Fund, and so they were working to restore sacred sites of Native American people. So one of the big ones, and he was actually one of the first Native American people to actually win one of these sacred sites access case, and it was up in Libby, Montana, for the Cootie Falls area. So yeah, he worked to restore these sacred sites because they were wanting to build a dam there, I believe. And so his job was to pretty much explain the importance of that land and that area to these native peoples. Yes.
Wonderful. So that was your grandfather.
Yep. Patrick Left Hand.
And he won a very important court case that really established a precedence here about protection of sacred sites and then integrating them into restoration of sacred sites as well.
That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I have a graduate student working with me, just started, Astra Lincoln. She's from California and she's moved north. She's going to be working on the headwaters of the Columbia River, which are in eastern British Columbia. And she's interested in water sovereignty issues, especially the crisis that Indigenous peoples have had with access to safe and secure water supplies, which is ironic, of course. But and of course, the Columbia River is a massively altered river, starting in Canada and moving right down to the mouth. But there's Peyton, do you know, there is I don't know the right term, but a sort of a disenfranchised group of we call it Tanaha, but the Kootenai peoples called the Sinixt. Are you familiar with them?
No. So the band I'm part of is the Sanka band. So that's down in Montana. Yeah. But yeah, Tanaha is Kootenai.
Yeah. So the Sinixt apparently they're living right on the border, I think, in the U.S. But they were disenfranchised, so they had their treaty rights stripped away in the mid 20th century, and they have been now fighting court battles to be reinstated. So it's really.
I've never heard of that.
I'll look into it more.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Well, I can hear the carillon bells going off on the oval here at the U of M, which means we're getting close to our time here.
Yeah.
And I know Travis wanted to have a word in here. So Travis, I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Yeah, well, thanks everyone for such a rich discussion, and thanks Dan and particularly Eric for just offering your thoughts and reflections on topics that are really important to many of the people on this call. Just appreciate the space. For our students, we have our next session scheduled for a couple of weeks from now. That will be on collaborative leadership, and we're very fortunate to have Sean Johnson from the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy, and Heather Stokes, who's also at the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy, and they were co-facilitators for the Governor's Grizzly Bear Advisory Council, which basically decided how the state management plan for grizzly bear is going forward, and that wrapped up last year. And they're going to come and share their reflections on co-facilitating that process and what they learned about collaborative environmental leadership along the way. So I'm really, really excited about that. But otherwise, I think we should definitely give Eric a big round of applause and thanks for coming and spending time with us.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks so much, Travis and Nick and Dan and everyone. It makes me really want to spend more time in Montana every time I've been at the University of Montana. It's been a great pleasure. And you're clearly doing something really remarkable there to have pulled together so much talent and ingenuity into conversation about restoration. So I'd like to be more a part of it. Thanks very much. Have a good evening.
Yep.
Probably late for dinner. See you later. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.